Hello and welcome to the next edition of Mystery Us. I'm Tony Pratt, your host for Mystery Us. Today we have an extremely fascinating guest, Brent Raynes, the author of John A. Keel, The Man, the Myths, and the Ongoing Mysteries. Brent is also the editor of Alternate Perceptions magazine. Welcome to Mystery Us, Brent.
Thank you very much, Tony. I appreciate it. It's an honor to be here.
Now, Brent, you were a friend of John Keel, and he was a well-known paranormal researcher. Um, what prompted you to write the book after his passing?
Well, he had really so influenced me in his work. You know, when I first took an interest in UFOs back in January of 1967 at age 14, I mostly was exposed to ideas about nuts and bolts extraterrestrial visitors. And in reading Keel's articles that came out at the time, different magazines, he was exploring alternative theories, that there was a paranormal component, that there might be one of the early people in the UFO field actually proposed ideas that were kind of like quantum physics and such.
Right.
And of course, we hear a lot more of that today and people exploring those kind of horizons. But back then, it was like a foreign language to the field of ufology, as it's been called. In October of 1969, I actually began to engage in correspondence with Keel, and I'll share some of those letters with you later. But
Cool.
this was before his popular books like Operation Trojan Horse and The Eighth Tower and the Mothman Prophecies, which later became a movie with Richard Gere and Laura Linney. Before those things actually came out, and the public at large had actual exposure on a much larger scale to his ideas and his work. But he influenced me deeply, and I actually engaged in the kind of research investigations that he did, and so I decided, he passed, and back in July 3rd of 2009, and I felt it was a great loss to the field. And it seemed like a lot of people in the UFO field had kind of forgotten Keel, so I thought, well, I'd go ahead and see about maybe interviewing people that had known him and preparing a book that was partly, biographical, and then also just telling the story from my perspective and others, and show also that, as the title says, it's an ongoing mystery, with...
Right, you keep coming up with new information about Keel. Now, he was a pioneer, really. He was ahead of his time. People like myself didn't really want to hear about, any kind of paranormal explanations or psychological or quantum physics, things that quantum physics talks about now.
Right,
Uh,
and it was something that it was very difficult at the time because the field was so dominated by, and still pretty much is, but especially back then, by the whole nuts and bolts ET perspective. And there was it was kind of, you were kind of shamed back then if you let it be known in the field that you were interested in his ideas and so on. And some of the major players like Dr. Hynek and Vallée, Keel says, were resistant to his ideas initially, but then over time, Vallée, as you can see, he's Jacques Vallée, a French scientist who became a good friend of Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who was, Project Blue Book consultant on astronomy for years. And Hynek himself also warmed up to Keel's ideas, because I actually met him in '72 and at his home in Illinois, and he said he found his ideas quite thought-provoking and interesting. And I've heard others say, and I know that Hynek began to warm up. He began to say in interviews things that indicated he was interested in the paranormal and the interdimensional theories, but he was hesitant to go very far with it. But Vallée, on the other hand, he delved quite deeply in it, beginning really in his 1969 book, Passport to Magonia, where he compared a lot of UFO landings and occupant reports to elementals and fairies and elves and such.
right, and Jacques Vallée was the model, I guess you would say, for the scientist in the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind, right?
Right, and which came out, I think, about 1977, and And of course, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, that was really based on Dr. Hynek's concept. There was Close Encounters of the First Kind, where an object is seen at a distance, and then the second kind, where it comes a little closer. And by the third, Close Encounters of the Third Kind was where occupants were seen. And of course, that's the story to the whole Close Encounters of the Third Kind, the movie, and where you have that happening and people having contact, and you know, they had an actor playing Dr. Hynek's part. I mean, Valet's part.
Right.
Of course, Hynek had a brief appearance. He was their UFO consultant, you know, for the
Right.
movie.
And now we have Close Encounters of the Fourth Kind. I guess that's when it's an interactive type process, when you're interacting with the
And
intelligences, we'll say.
Yeah.
Now, Rosemary Guiley was your friend and a fellow author, and she has also recently passed away. And she is in your, she did your forward to your book, and she wrote about how John Keel was wired differently. What did she what did she mean?
Well, she you know, Keel had noted that a lot of the contact experiences were, you know, felt that they had more of a psychic profile,
Right.
and they saw things a little differently. And this is a whole area to be studied by psychologists and psychiatrists. And in fact, I was friends with a psychiatrist who was a friend of Keel's, and I was, you know, even have a chapter in his book, UFO Dynamics, which was two volume of over 500 pages, where he actually went out and studied experiences and was very aware of the psychic profile. So he confirmed a lot of the points that Keel had made. It's something that ufology was very resistant to, but Keel had articles in like England's Flying Saucer Review from with lots and lots of people from many different foreign countries contributing articles on close encounter events. And again and again, even, you know, back in the late 60s, early 70s, these articles the researchers involved began to confirm Keel's whole idea about the paranormal components, and how the objects could almost ghost-like appear, disappear, and had other anomalous things. Of course, many are experiences describe like telepathic communication and
Sounds like Bigfoot.
lots of high strange and lots of different kind of entities, ghosts, Bigfoot, or whatever. You know, and of course, everybody in cryptozoology, lots of people don't agree with that perspective either. There's resistance in that field. There's resistance in parapsychology.
Yeah, resistance would be putting it mildly.
Yeah, and sometimes people, you know, they get into real arguments, you know, heated arguments, emotional. I remember one guy who he still has a radio show, and he dared to propose that Bigfoot was connected and had paranormal components. And one guy wanted to know where he lived because he wanted to come over and punch him in the nose. You know,
Well, I can assure you Bigfoot does definitely have paranormal components. As a matter of fact, the Hindu Vedas described ape men with mystic powers of telepathy and invisibility. And they do have true invisibility, which I wouldn't expect anybody to believe it unless you experience it firsthand for yourself. But it's absolutely the fact. And that researcher, it was ostracized for many years. He's got a little bit more respect now. I know who you're talking about. Now, let's get a shot of your book, just so we can get a close shot of it here for a second. Now, Keel had an opinion about these hypnotic explorations of mainstream researchers and what you term contact experiences. That includes both abductees and contactees, right?
right. Anyone who had, you know, recurrent experiences with the beings and some sort of interactive communication, contact, physical, psychic. Sometimes people would say they were in their astral bodies.
Right.
But he was aware of this back in the late 60s. He had traveled through about 20 different states, and he had written an article about the UFO occupants back then for a major magazine, which at that time Ufology didn't really want to look at the occupant cases. They were the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, which the retired Major Donald Keyhoe had started back in 1956, avoided any report of a being coming out of a craft because he felt that associated with the contactee crowd, the people who claimed the Space Brothers and all this,
Right.
positive stuff, and they were trying to portray, visiting scientists from an extraterrestrial source, and not talking about spiritual things and such. But there were a lot of experiences, and he particularly attacked George Adamski over and over, in
Yeah.
his writing. So they avoided that. They were trying to get a congressional hearing. Again, the whole disclosure process started back then, and they like the Air Force didn't treat anyone who claimed they saw an occupant or a landing even seriously. And it wasn't until Vallée came over from France and met Dr. Hynek in 1963 that he showed where he investigated like a major UFO wave involving occupants and landings in France back in 1954, and it opened Hynek's eyes. And then he investigated the 1964 Socorro, New Mexico incident with that police officer, and he realized, oh, well, I guess I need to look at all this a little more closer.
Right.
I mean, he said he looked at them like they were just ghost stories at the time, and
Sure.
thought that some of the landing trace cases were just where some teenagers went out and poured some gasoline and lit a match or something, along
And
that
when
line.
you experience the unexplainable, it's hard to explain it. I
Yeah.
mean, and yeah, people like George Adamski, and I don't know how credible he really is or not, but you tell your story from your own perspective, and it sounds crazy because under normal circumstances it is crazy, but these things really happen, and
Yeah.
people don't always have the best way of explaining it, but the fact is, this phenomena, you can, if you really want to prove it to yourself, you can seek and you will find all these different phenomena, and you can experience a lot of things that, a lot of people have experienced a lot of things that they don't even talk about because of the
Right, and
climate.
I've met people with PhDs who've had credible backgrounds, and they've waited till their retirement, and then they come out and they tell about the paranormal UFO experiences that they've had, and I've had an opportunity to work with some of these people in the field, and like I say, my friend and psychiatrist I was in touch with him for over about 37 years till he passed, Dr. Berthold Eric Schwartz, who was a friend of Keel's, and he was a psychiatrist, and he went out. He didn't sit behind a desk and say, "Oh, this is all hallucinations and delusions." He went out in the
Right.
field and he checked these things out himself. And this is what Keel tried to do: is get with professionals in different areas of mental health and such to review what this syndrome, these unusual events. And he found again and again that many of them had other experiences, and he tied it in with a lot of very bewildering paranormal elements. He came to feel that there was like a trickster element to it, and
Yeah.
and he felt it was they were deceptive. And as in a case that he investigated, there was the Silver Bridge collapse in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, on the Ohio River, where it connected with the Ohio side, and he had been given different predictions by people in that UFO-infested area, with also the reports of the Mothman, the 6, 7 foot tall winged being with the red eyes that people had been reporting. And
Right. Now, where's the location of the original sightings of Mothman?
well, it was in and around Point Pleasant
Point Pleasant,
area of West Virginia.
West Virginia, right.
And of course, that's portrayed in very sketchy detail in the movie, The Mothman Prophecies, which is based on the same title of Keel's book from 1975. But he writes a lot of the paranormal things that happened there, and he said that a pattern that he found was that in the beginning, an experiencer would become convinced that the beings knew the future, which he found himself, but then they would lead up with something really spectacular, and he said it was like the tiger behind the door of prophecy. They'd say like the world's going to end on such and such a date, and they rush, and because everything else had proven true, they
Right.
assume that, well, this is going to happen, and then they'd be made fools of.
Yeah.
He even told a story of a contact experiencer from the 1940s who had been taken by these beings in a cave, and he supposedly escaped them, and some being, before he got completely away, overheard this being say, "Let's make him look like a fool." And then he came
Wow.
to in a field, and then, of course, he went and told the story, and he was considered a fool. You know?
Right, and a lot of times when you're out in the field researching the phenomena and you think you know a certain thing or you've experienced things a certain way that happen a certain way, and you maybe say it out loud to someone that you're with, you know, this is how it works, and as soon as you say that, it'll start working a different way.
Yeah, I remember Brad Steiger, you know, who wrote an introduction to my book, Visitors from Hidden Realms. If you want
Yeah,
to show
another
was,
book. Yeah, you've got several books.
that was from, I have 3 that I've written myself. This one was my first one in 2004 by Eelwing Books, and Brad Steiger wrote actually a 6-page introduction, and he said he reviewed, I think, about 17 major theories, and they would all start out, okay, yeah, this sounds good, and then sooner or later there'd be some part of the evidence that he would come across that would just, you know, demolish that particular line of thought. So,
Yeah.
so I had, he kind of liked an expression that I had interviewed a Native American practitioner who had said that, you know, it's according to who's telling the story as to what the truth is, you know.
Right.
And so there's a lot of
It's the
storytellers.
perspective, yeah, and
Now, and on the negative aspect, the trickster element, from a Native American perspective, I was told that, and this is where it gets tricky, that that they believed that you know, a trickster could actually be a teacher and could test your intentions and see if you really catch on to what, you know, the truth is or what the reality is, or if you're even worthy of receiving higher knowledge. And if you get past the trickster and the little webs of deception or entrapments, then you may qualify for elevating to higher truth and understanding. So Keel saw it as all bad. I even mentioned to him once on the phone about what about the angel reports. I say, I notice you always take this negative, demonic approach. And he said, well, he said, I guess you didn't get my letter back in the late 60s where I sent around to different people, and it was a letter he distributed out to other people in the field. He said he had the feeling that this was all negative, that didn't have our best intentions at heart, because you can
right.
get that same message from reading his various books. And so he saw it as all dark and negative. But what if it's, you know, like Valet had written, he had the expression of meta logic, that what if it's trying to convey a higher truth through, you know, like Zen expressions. I think they call them coins, like the one hand clapping and trying to reveal
Right.
underlying hidden truths that don't translate too well in our understanding. But
The one hand clapping may be the sound of when you get smacked across the face.
that may be. But he used a case from 1954 in France where someone had been in encounter with an alien being, and the being asked him, "What time is it?" And he said something like, "Oh, it's 2:30."
Right.
And the being said, "No, you lie. That's not the time." Well, maybe the message was, Valley said, that that time is a man-made structure. That
Right.
you know,
It's just a construct.
rock. So it's deeper than that. And also asked, "What country is this?" And he said, "What country?" Guinea. He said, "No, it's not." Yeah. So he thought maybe this was meta logic, and this was trying to reveal how the truth as we understand it is
Right.
more.
The best Native American line I've heard was, I believe it's the same Bigfoot researcher you were talking about before. I may be wrong. Quaney, Jack Lapsaritis. Quaney's his Native American name they gave him, and he was in Texas. And he was out in the field with a Native American chief, and a UFO was hovering above the field. And he said, "Why don't they just land and come out and talk to us?" And the chief replied, if you were them, would you want to talk to an ant?" You know? So
So
maybe they're so more advanced than us that they have to use different kind of methods really to get the message across, like crop circles. No one has figured out crop circles quite
well,
precisely.
yeah, we know that there are people who do hoax them, but
Sure.
in fact, it's become kind of a sport over in England. But even some of the people who hoax them admit that I was out there in the field, and suddenly I saw a ball of light,
Yeah.
and and it's like again the trickster, but it's trying to reveal something maybe to us and
Right.
affect our collective unconscious maybe.
There seems to be a dark side and a positive side to everything. Of course, people hoax everything. They hoax Bigfoot, they hoax UFOs. Even the United States government was caught hoaxing a UFO landing in Canada with a helicopter with some fancy lights. Um, Now, the contactees, like you said, are more positive. It's all good. The you know the brotherhood of light or whatever is coming down to heal mankind, and everything's happy, happy, joy, joy. But then the abductees are very traumatized and in a very real sense. Um,
Yeah, and it can be traumatic even for the contactees, but sometimes the person starts out feeling that they've been violated, feeling the abduction,
yeah,
and they start out as an abductee, and then later on they change their position, and some people might say, well, it's like the Stockholm syndrome, they start to identify with their captors or whatever. But I know that the Dr. Edgar Mitchell Foundation for Research into Extraterrestrial and Extraordinary Experiences studied the contact experiencers, and they found a very high percentage of them, and they've got a database now surveyed about 4,200 that showed that many of them feel it was a positive and beneficial. Even about 50% of them even felt they'd been healed by their experiences.
yeah,
See, now Kathy Marden, she has been conducting a extensive study of contact experiences, and she also was a consultant with Free, I guess still is, and she was the niece of Betty Hill. Now, Betty and Barney Hill are really pretty much recognized as a couple who had the first publicized alien abduction experience back in September 1961, which is detailed in John G. Fuller's uh, The Interrupted Journey in 1966. And of course now it's become, anybody in the UFO field knows this case because
right.
it's so popular.
It's
And
like the Roswell of abductees. Yeah,
yeah, absolutely. And Kathy has been investigating this quite a number of years now, and not only her but her mother and herself have had what they believe are abduction experiences. And so this is and she also from personal experience recognized the paranormal element when I was at her mother's house in Kingston, New Hampshire back in July 1976 as a guest of Betty Hill.
mm.
And I got to meet Kathy's mother, Janet Miller, and found out that she believed her house was haunted. I talked to Kathy about it, and Kathy believes that this was part of the UFO effect. That one night she was there, and some years back, and she heard this commotion from another bedroom. She had her young son in there.
Mm-hmm.
He was like 5 years old, and she wanted him to. She was going to go in and tell him to settle down. He was jumping around the room, and she opened the door, and she was startled to see this small little orb flying around the room, and he was swatting at it.
Nice.
And a little round ball, and of course to her mother, Janet, these were just ghostly phenomena, but
Sure.
to Kathy, she saw it as maybe a monitoring device or some artifact from the UFO experience. And she's just written a book on the abduction experiences, which is available on Amazon, which details her statistics. I think she had 600 experiences, and a lot of them were the abductees, because they had contacted MUFON, and she was doing follow-ups with her and a team of researchers. And even though there are more abductees than with the Free group, the same paranormal and psychological elements are all still at come into play there.
Right.
So it's you know, we're coming to understand, I think, these things more and more. And she, in the book, she describes a lot of the paranormal things, the really weird case histories that come up.
Right, in your book, your latest book, John Keel, that we're talking about here, uh, it could almost be called the history of ufology and the paranormal. I mean, it's got so much stuff. It's got it's just jam packed with information, and you're probably the greatest UFO historian I know about. Um,
No, I'm
now,
not the greatest, but thank you.
well, you seem to have a mind like a steel trap on remembering all the details of these cases in the past. Um, but in your book, you also talk about some amazing psychics like Uri Geller, right?
Yeah, yeah, and talk about being wired differently. Let me just tell that back on November 30th of 2018, I followed up on this report that at Harvard Medical School had these two medical doctors talking about experiences of orbs, UFOs, paranormal occurrences, and they felt that these people were wired differently. And this really goes along with what Keel, what Rosemary Guiley said about Keel. She felt he was wired differently himself, although he didn't really talk about it that much. But when you learn about Keel's, you know, experiences, not only what's recorded like in his investigations at Point Pleasant, West Virginia, which, you know, is in the movie and people can kind of see that. There was a lot more in his growing up years. You know, when he was a child, there was like a poltergeist phenomenon in his grandparents' home where he was staying, and there were rapping sounds on the wall in his bedroom, and he would rap back and try to develop a code. I mean, here he was, a young kid working with the paranormal there, and he had actually seen a large barn-sized sphere of light along with his mother and his stepdad rising from a hill. At first they thought it was a barn on fire, and he was only like 7, but the memory of it was just burned into his mind. I mean, and then later on, he tried to talk with his mother and his stepdad about it, and learned that they had forgotten about it. He couldn't imagine how they could have forgotten the story, you know, because later on when he started studying this thing back, you know, when he was an adult, he realized, oh, there's missing time, there's amnesia associated a lot of times with these experiences. And he also had confided to someone else, a British researcher, that he had thought about doing a book on, and he was wanting to interview a lot of people who were involved in, say, kind of like shamanism or witchcraft, because he felt some of these people described how they could partially control elemental type forms to their own, you know, what they wanted them to do. And he felt that he had, when he was growing up, that he kind of had that ability, but he tried to steer away from it, you know, by doing academic type studies, chemistry and different science stuff, you know, and he eventually kind of, that inkling he had, that ability kind of subsided until he was about 18. He had one of those cosmic consciousness experiences where the room lit up with this mysterious glow, and suddenly he knew the answer to everything.
Right.
But the next day, it was gone. But
he really wanted to be an atheist, right? I mean, he wanted to be a scientist. He didn't want to believe in
right,
mysticism.
he wanted things to be supported by science, but he loved magic. He loved doing you know, the magic tricks. In fact, he thought about being a stage magician.
But he didn't want real magic, though.
No,
right?
it was to pretend. You know, he enjoyed stories, you know, about space travel, science, magic, and things, and he loved, you know, the mystery of it. He loved solving, like, you know, in the 1950s, he wrote a book called Jadoo, Mysteries of the Orient, where he traveled through India and places, and he wanted to come up with all the answers to everything, you know, be very scientific. And he knew magic, but, you know, journalism had kind of taken over in his life. And around age 14, he started writing a newspaper column in his hometown of Perry, New York. But when he was in his 20s, in the 1950s, he was over in Europe, and he traveled through, you know, Egypt. He became a radio correspondent. And anyway, he wanted to show that these street magicians that some people considered holy individuals.
Right.
They had divine gifts and so on. Where he learned their tricks. You know, there was the
Yeah.
Indian rope trick, and there was being buried alive, and he learned all their different little secrets.
Did he learn the Indian rope trick? Climb up the rope and.
Yeah, yeah, he learned that one. He writes about that in his book Jadoo. Don't ask me to try to repeat that here, but but one of the things that he couldn't explain though was he met this holy man who read his thoughts, and so he was quite intrigued by that. You know, he was talking to the guy, and so he says, "Let me demonstrate this for you." So put an idea, an image in your head, and I'll tell you what it is. And so I think the first thing he thought of was his boots. And the man says, "Oh, come on, Mr. Keel, you can do better than that. Make it harder." and so Keel wanted to know, "How do you do this?" And he says, "Well, it's very complicated, and you can't just I can't just tell you how it's done, and you've got to actually practice this, and it can take years. But he says, I will tell you that you have to be in meditation, and it's like you're going down a path. And as you go down this path, certain images will appear, you know, in this process. And
Right.
in a very simplified explanation, that's it. And then also, while he was over there, he went through different villages where there were reports of Yeti.
Right.
And so he got interested in that. And when he was like 10 years old
Yeti is the Himalayan Bigfoot.
right, I'm glad
Right.
you explained that because some viewers may not know, but when he was, this would have been 1940, he was about 10 years old in New York, up near Buffalo, New York, and farmers in the area, and he knew they were very credible people, and they were describing a gorilla, and they, you know, some terrifying encounters, and the hunters came out with their rifles and hunted for it, and as often happens, it just disappeared. You know?
Yes.
And of course, people thought, you know, well, it must have been from some zoo or some circus come through or
Right.
something.
Try to come up with some logical explanation.
Yeah, and after a while, it gets forgotten, you know. But this helped to develop early on, I think, his interest in, you know, toward the cryptozoology, and so, in fact, one of his first books was Strange Creatures from Time and Space, which came out around the same year as Operation Trojan Horse, although most people talk about Operation Trojan Horse and the Mothman Prophecies, his most popular books.
Yeah.
But,
You mentioned shamanism a minute ago, and you actually make Peruvian whistling vessels,
well, I don't,
right? Or you
don't make, actually, my wife Joan, who's sitting over there, but
Okay.
she doesn't want to be on camera, she actually tried her hand at it. We got with a gentleman who actually discovered what they call the psychoacoustical properties of the whistles back in 1972 in Pennsylvania when he was at an auction, and he bought this Peruvian whistle from the Chimu culture, which is back, you know, a pre-Columbian whistle that would sell now on the internet for several thousand. He got it for like $45, you know.
Yeah.
The antique guy obviously had no idea its value.
And aren't there like 7 different types or sizes? Like, does it correspond to musical notes, or how does it work?
Well, actually, it's a high frequency, and when you blow other whistles together, they generally think it's like a binaural beat, that kind of like the Monroe Institute, Bob Monroe, the out-of-body traveler that
Absolutely.
many people, yes, it still exists. He's passed on now, but his daughter and others keep it going in Virginia. And they believe that this binaural beat actually helps people to remote view or have out-of-body type
Yeah, I believe it.
experiences.
We did a thing with a shaman lady. I forget her name. Was that at the University of Alabama?
It was Benita Luz.
Benita Luz. Yeah, and she has she trains people to do the ayahuasca and the whole deal over in.
Well, she's not really involved herself in the ayahuasca, but
Okay.
And that's all in this book.
But you don't
here.
really need drugs when you've got those whistling vessels. We blew into those vessels, and there were 7. You had 7 of them. we were on a stage at the University of Alabama, and I'd had lots of experience with out of body before, but that was like the easiest way that I've ever found. In my perception, I felt like I was blowing into it for like 40 minutes without taking a breath. It doesn't seem possible to just breathe out for 40 minutes, but that was my perception,
Yeah.
you know, and I solved the riddle of the Nazca lines. I went over to Peru and went into a cave and came up out of Lake Titicaca, and I flew above the Nazca lines, and my perception was that the purpose was so that shamans could train initiates, apprentices, so that when they flew up, because there weren't any flying vehicles, and, you know, I mean, how are you trying to communicate with, you know, UFOs? Some of these ancient astronaut theorists, you know, believe that it has something to do with aliens or whatever, but my belief ever since then, because I knew it was true, is that the purpose is just to, you know, when the apprentices are flying in their spirit bodies up there, if they identify the correct objects, then it's real. They're not just imagining it.
Well, yeah, it's now I probably ought to explain. Binaural is where you have one frequency coming in one ear and one in the other,
Right.
and they're a little different.
Yeah, yeah.
And a third one is created in between. That's the binaural.
Right.
And that can be conducive, along with harmonic frequencies, some say, to having these experiences. It may do something between the hemispheres. You know, a lot of people think that the right hemisphere, yeah, the right hemisphere of the brain, we have two of them, left and right, and the logic mostly and analytical things is in the left. And the right is more, a lot of parapsychologists feel, where the artistic, creative, and psychic elements reside.
Sure.
And so in meditation, you can bring kind of a greater exchange between the hemispheres. And even Albert Einstein, who used to take visionary type journeys and learn things from these about science, you know, the great creative process here. And Edgar Cayce used to use hypnosis to read the psychic records about people's health and stuff.
Yeah.
He used hypnosis, and they both, I understand, had thicker corpus callosums that connect both the hemispheres of the brain, creating a greater exchange of information and communication between the hemispheres. But yeah, when we use the Peruvian vessels, we get a lot of people who can actually experience the kind of shamanic effects, and like yourself, they'll see things and experience things. And one time, I'll just tell this real quickly, we had Andrew Collins from England visiting my friend and co-editor, Dr. Greg Riddle, psychologist over in Memphis, Tennessee, along with another local guy there, and myself. There were actually, I think, 7 of us.
And Andrew Collins is a big crop circle guy. And
Well, Andrew Collins, he has been in the crop circles, but he's most known for his current writings, study in ancient histories.
Okay.
You know, he's written a book with Dr. Little just recently that came out a few months ago, the Denisovan origins, about.
And Dr. Greg Little was involved with the Edgar Cayce Foundation.
Right, right. And my wife, Joan, and I, we've been involved in going on some of the ARE mound tours in Ohio and
Yeah, the
West
ARE
Virginia
is
and
the
such.
Association for Research and Enlightenment. Yeah, I was a member of that when I lived in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, and used to go to the Edgar Cayce Museum all the time.
Oh, wow, yeah.
They've
well,
got the complete individual reference files in the library there,
that's
which is
where it
just the pure
began.
readings, not a book about, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's pretty phenomenal. Anyway, there was, yeah, as I started to say, there was no, that's all good. I just got to try to stay on track here, because we're covering so many different angles. But
Yeah.
there was, and my wife was there too. We were all out on a pontoon, and we're blowing the whistles, and anyway, as we get to talking afterwards, myself, Greg Little, Andrew Collins, and a local landscaper, we all realized we saw this swirling vortex type thing. Now,
Right.
we saw it a little different. Some saw it like energy, some saw it like water, but it was like a vortex. And I asked, okay, which way was yours going? And yours, and we all 4 of us saw a vortex that was spinning in the same direction. And Andrew Collins, who studied a lot on shamanism and such, you'll see him on Ancient Aliens quite a bit, talking from different locations of the world, will tell that, he was getting excited, saying, you need to really get a group of people, which never have done, but to try to explore this and try to enter this vortex, and then maybe you can swing out to some target or some psychic destination that you can pursue, do experiments with it. There's just so many different angles and aspects one can pursue in this business.
Yeah.
I got kind of caught up for
That's
a few
awesome.
years in electronic voice phenomena, but
Right.
anyway.
But speaking of vortexes, though, you and I actually met at a secret UFO vortex that was featured in Life magazine in March 2000, their UFO issue. Strangely enough, they came to Middle Tennessee, and the only other place they really went to do the research was Roswell. And as far as it being secret, it was not really a secret. I mean, people have came there from all over the world, and people know about it. It's just that they don't really want to publicize exactly where it's at because of pranksters that might come up there and get shot by the neighbors who don't really like trespassers on their property, type thing. So it's really more for the protection of the public. It's not really a secret, but have you had what can you tell people about the vortex up there?
Well, people are looking for different locations where these experiences seem to cluster. Keel called them window areas. And in fact, back in his days, he was encouraging people to get these survey maps of, geomagnetic survey maps that the U.S. Geological Survey had done back in the 50s and 60s, flown aircraft over many areas where there are magnetic deviations and so on. And I interviewed a gentleman who actually took a lot of equipment for doing this very thing, and found that he was amazed at a lot of the sacred sites from different parts of the world, and had these, he wondered, how did the ancient people know that this particular point would have this kind of anomaly? Because again and again and again he found this. And he found the strongest one over near Albuquerque, New Mexico, was just 17-mile long mesa that had all these thousands of examples of Indian artwork on these rocks. It was volcanic rock from thousands and thousands of years old. And he found some of the most powerful reefs. In fact, one point he got in his car and he drove along because he could see the field was moving.
Right.
And so he wanted to try to record it and see where it went to. And I think he lost it. But there was a guide there who worked at the site, and she came up to him and says, I understand that you're detecting some unusual magnetic fields. And she says, I've heard people come up and say they were, kind of new agey type people, wanted to experience the energy, and I always thought they were a little flaky. But she says, you're telling me that this might actually be real.
Yeah.
But
so you think it has something to do with the energies that people in the past put into the place, or that it's, is it got anything to do with ley lines, or the Earth's magnetic field?
Yeah, there's a I really don't know what I know the study of ley lines, particularly in England and Cusco, Peru, and locations where certain places were like on a straight line as monuments and ritual sites.
Yeah.
And certainly the magnetic field thing is quite fascinating. And of course you have Dr. Michael Persinger, who passed away a little while ago, but he had what they call the God helmet that would send out magnetic pulses, and he detected, found certain areas of the brain. He'd put this helmet on volunteer students and in an isolated room and send these signals, and they would actually start to see, a lot of them, kind of visions of different things, ghosts, aliens, or strange lights. And I apologize. I realized a little while ago I started talking about that talk at Harvard Medical School, and I didn't finish it.
Okay, go ahead.
The gentleman that, the two gentlemen, one was Gary Nolan, who works at Stanford and is considered an expert on a lot of these kind of, biological studies, I'll say. And then of course, Christopher Kit Green, who was actually a doctor, an MD and a PhD, who worked for the CIA back in 1972 till about, I think, 1985 or 86. And he still worked for the government on different projects years afterwards. But he became intrigued in the paranormal because, and the UFO element, because he experienced it in the early studies of remote viewers and psychokinesis. Because you know, Ingo Swann told about UFO encounters. Uri Geller was, had his stories about the UFO encounters, and which you can read about in Andrea Piharge's Uri, which was published back, I think, 1970 or 71, and various
And
other
these are
books.
all like superstars of remote viewing, out-of-body,
Right.
psychic perception.
So anyway, in a
Yeah.
nutshell, he still studied them, and he has over 100 cases of many of them military people, very grounded people. But it became about because Uri Geller, I think, pretty much came about because he realized that he did some remote viewing with Geller. It was right on, very impressive, and with himself, and he didn't believe it could be done. He was
Right.
quite skeptical. And then on top of that, he was involved in another site about 30 miles from Stanford Research Institute, where they were working with nuclear scientists, and they wanted to study with Geller involved to see if he could, psychokinesis. They wanted to understand the psychokinesis.
Move objects with his mind.
Yeah,
yes.
and they wanted to see if maybe, like, if a missile's coming at us, can we teach people to psychically?
I'd hate to rely on that.
Well, this is something the military was interested in, and we certainly wanted to stay ahead of the Russians and the Chinese.
Yeah.
But what happened was that all of a sudden these very grounded, stable scientists, were reporting that they're seeing balls of light.
Wow.
They're seeing large dark birds walking around, some really weird stuff.
Yeah.
And I even talked to Uri Geller over the phone one time about it, and I told him a story of where he had visited a radio station up in Ohio, and he didn't even know the story. He said, well, that's a major event too. But there were some of the people at the radio station who afterwards, after his visit, saw one of the big antennas just sort of crumble down and crash to the ground, and then afterwards it turned out it didn't really happen.
Wow.
But that's what they saw, and they weren't really paranormal people. But
Yeah.
Earl Neff had investigated it and told me about it privately, and it was quite major. So I was in touch with some of the people that Geller knew, including Eldon Bird, who was a naval scientist in Maryland. He tested him, and he was blown away by Geller's abilities.
Yeah.
But apparently, I think this is where Christopher Kit Green, why he's so obsessed with us from those early studies and what happened to those scientists, and that's what he's studying is the.
And another topic that you know about, you started to go into it earlier, before I disrupted you, is EVP, electronic voice phenomena, also known as spirit box communication.
Yeah, and
tell us about that.
Yeah, it's in my book where, I was really feeling, after Keel had passed away, what a loss to people in the field, the people who study these things. And I was started doing some ghost investigations with some people, and we were working with Brett Oldham, who was an experiencer since age 5, began with a ghost sighting and an alien sighting, which has haunted him for his life. But anyway, we started out just investigating the paranormal with this, and I was really kind of skeptical. I'd tried to do some EVP things.
And Brett's
years earlier.
book is called Children of the Gray. Just give you a plug there, Brett.
Yes, he's written several books. But anyway, we'd been getting at these investigations John Keel coming through. So one day, it was July 3rd of 2010, the 1-year anniversary of his passing, and I said, you guys mind if we, try to reach John Keel? And so everybody was agreeable to it, as I figured they would be. And anyway, that night, We did 2 sessions, and some of the things that we recorded was, Brett asked, his contact on the other side, Bishop, can you have John Keel, if you can reach him, say his name? And within like 2 seconds, John Keel. I mean,
Yeah.
how coincidental,
Yeah.
And then he asked, what can you tell us about Bigfoot? Because, he knew that Keel was a cryptozoologist too.
Mm-hmm.
And Brett had an encounter with Bigfoot in Ohio years earlier when he was a teenager. So all of a sudden, again, this strong male voice comes through, and it sounds what he's saying is smuck, not the other word,
Right.
Bigfoot, see? And then another voice says see, and another one says see. I mean, high strangeness. And then
Was that referring to a certain researcher, or
oh no,
that's a different story.
yeah, yeah. There was let's see. Well, one of the let's see how. Okay.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to throw you off.
Yeah, there was that too, but
We won't mention any names, of course.
yeah.
Everyone knows who we're talking about.
Yeah. And then that same night, I asked about what can you tell us about Jaddu? And Jaddu is, of course, the book he wrote, Jaddu, Mysteries of the Orient. Jaddu was a word over in that part of the world that means black magic.
Mm-hmm.
And he all of a sudden this male voice comes through and says, Jaddu, eh? That's what it sounded like, was but it was Jaddu, eh? And then I says, yes, what can you tell us about Jaddu? And it says, into the fire, into the fire. And he just keeps talking, but he kind of fades in and out.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last of it was, teach me outside. And so I don't have the whole message, but I've kind of guessed, into the fire, black magic. I think that kind of almost is self-explanatory. And then as for teach me outside, Keel was someone who read books, articles constantly. He was,
Right, and let's explain what we're talking about as far as the spirit box. What is that technically?
Well, it's one of the more popular forms of using white noise, like when we had the old TVs where after the shows were over you get all that white noise.
When the TV turns off.
This is it scans. You fix the digital radio you get from Radio Shack, fix it where it goes on continuous scan, and there's white noise in between the regular stations.
Yeah.
And supposedly, and I think this was the idea of some spirits supposedly, to create this technology so that they could periodically come in and interject their voices. And
yeah, and I was very skeptical before I experienced it for myself, but the voice sounded exactly like my dad, and the way that Brett does it, he has the spirit say their name and the name of the person that they're wanting to communicate with. So, a friend of mine's husband had passed away a year earlier, and I was hoping he would come through, and he did. And he was a very famous drummer, and it was amazing. The things that were said were, there's no way that Brett knew anything about this individual or my dad, and how could they fake his voice on it? It's just, it has to be real. I mean, that doesn't mean it's really spirits. We don't know what the real source of it is. It could be demons. Yes, preachers. We don't know what it is.
Well, yeah,
Spirits might think they're demons,
but it's interesting how it correlates these sessions with names of people you're seeking. That's how I,
Right.
The very first time I was there with Brett, it was at Sandy Nichols Thompson Station outside Nashville, and I sat out of the session so that I could watch our grandson Connor and my wife and our daughter could do the session, because I didn't think it was any big deal anyway, and then they came out and told me that they were hearing familiar names, including Joan's name, and felt like it was pretty weird. So
Yeah.
that's how I began to.
Well, I hate to cut it short, but it's all in the book. John A. Keel, The Man, the Myths, and the Ongoing Mysteries. Thank you for being our guest on Mystery Us, Brent Raynes.
Thank you, Tony. I appreciate it very much. Enjoyed it very much.
thought